Chapter 7. Rob stopped when he got to the second floor. A new surge of anxiety hit him. With each set of stairs he descended, he expected to find the killer standing at the base of them, waiting to kill him. He could not go down the final flight required to get to the main door. His heart could not take it. It didn't make sense for the killer to be gone. The demons couldn't follow him into the lit hallways. If he so badly wanted to kill him, then he would not be gone. He would be right outside getting some air, and when Rob exited the lobby door, he would be pounced on. He could even be waiting, sitting nonchalant on the hood of Sue's car, peeling an apple with a large hunting knife that he would then peel Rob's skin off with. Rob didn't know if the killer even knew what Sue's car looked like. He really didn't want to find out, but he had to. His original plan was made even more desperate by the altercation. It wasn't even so much of an altercation. Rob had pretty much just taken his lumps. He was lucky that was all he had gotten. He was lucky to have gotten out of it alive. It wasn't over, though. It didn't feel over. He couldn't stand not knowing what was coming next. He focused on what he could do, instead of on what the killer might do. He had to get back to the car. That was the next step of the journey. Or maybe the end of it, if the killer got to him first, but he could not control that part. He couldn't stay where he was, where he had lived the last several days in the warm companionship of Sue and Michelle. He had to move forward, even if it was to an end, but he focused on his destination up north. He planned on getting to it, but if he was not allowed, so be it. He just needed to stop his knees from shaking and move his feet down that last flight of stairs. He heard sirens off in the distance. They were getting closer. Mrs. Cranston had made the call after all. He turned out to be grateful. He had been so insistent with her that she not call for help. He had not wanted any interference. He figured the stubborn, nosy old bat wouldn't listen, but he had forgotten about her after he closed the door in her face. She had poked her nose in, and maybe that helped to keep the monsters on their side of the wall. They had been so close, too close, but their interference had benefited him as well. He was beginning to feel that not everything was up to him in the intense melodrama. He was a bit relieved. He had felt the burden of it all for some time. He'd been responsible for Sue and Michelle's well-being, and for doing all he could to prevent the killer from harming them or others. He felt responsible to get the word out on how to stop the demons, and for everyone they would get until he could. He felt responsible for Sue and Michelle in his absence. He even felt guilt over something as relatively trivial as being the reason they had to take the bus instead of the car. All that was beginning to go lax, and not just from the adrenaline crash that was hitting him hard. Things were working out the way they needed to work out. Maybe it was the voice that was helping in part. Mrs. Cranston making those sirens come gave him a sense of security. Sirens would have the opposite effect on the killer than the sirens at sea with their luring effect on shipmates. They would at the very least become a big inconvenience for his enemy. Those sirens also gave Rob more incentive to get down those stairs, and fast. They could become quite an inconvenience for him as well. He could not afford to get arrested. There was too much at stake. He had a quick flash of himself in a jail cell when he realized that prisoners must make excellent sitting targets for the demons. The ones in solitary cells, maybe the ones in the majorly overcrowded state facilities, were safe as long as they always had a cellmate. Rob ran down the stairs on autopilot. He didn't realize he had sent the impulse to his legs to get moving for real. His torso felt like it was just going for a ride on those pumping and aching limbs. He threw open the heavy lobby door with ease and continued down the building's front steps before coming to a stop on the sidewalk. He looked all around very quickly. The dangerous being wasn't in sight. He wasn't felt either. The sirens were coming down the street. Rob couldn't see them yet. That meant they couldn't see him either. Any moment they would turn the corner and be in plain sight. The shriek of the sirens was beginning to pierce his ears, and those ears were not all too sensitive from going to many a rock concert. They were really close. At the first sight of the red and blue lights bouncing off a neighboring building's brick wall, he ran full speed around the corner and towards the car. He saw the car up ahead in his shaky running vision. He almost felt like he was watching television. He was completely detached emotionally. All the adrenaline had faded, and he was numb. There was no monster of an excuse for a human being, if he even could be considered human, sitting on the hood or the roof. Rob wasn't even worried that the killer would be crouched in the back seat. There was no more worry at all. Rob was doing what he could, and that was all he could do. He had turned himself over to the mercy of the fates. He trusted they would be kind enough to just get him the few more yards to the car anyway. They were that kind. He put the key in the door and noticed the car was empty when the light inside came on. He got in the driver's seat and closed the door, which turned off the light, just as the police cars and a fire truck pulled up in front of Sue and Michelle's apartment building. The emergency vehicles came to a stop, blocking the street. Their engines idled loudly, and their siren lights continued to dizzily spin around, even if they had finally been silenced. Rob slouched in the seat a bit. He knew they would not notice him. He wasn't even parked under a streetlight. He wouldn't start the car up yet. That might make someone notice him. He watched a few officers get buzzed into the building, probably by Mrs. Cranston. Other cops and 2 firemen stood and talked on the street. Rob waited for a while. Nothing much seemed to be happening very quickly. He couldn't remember if he had locked the apartment door behind him. He was then grateful again to Mrs. Cranston for calling 911. The officers would surely take care of that for him. If he had locked it, then maybe that's why things were going so slowly. They would have to wake the superintendent and have him let them in. If it was still unlocked, then they surely would lock it behind themselves when they were done examining the ransacked residence. He would have to call Sue soon. Maybe she would feel safer coming home while policemen were still there. They could help brace her for all the damage. The living room was totally trashed. He wasn't sure if it was safe yet. The killer obviously had no trouble getting in. The door hadn't been broken through, though. Rob couldn't picture him squatting and patiently picking a lock. Maybe the killer was learning the necessity of stealth. "All right, settle down, ma'am," the young officer calmly said to Mrs. Cranston in the hallway. "It's all over now. We just need to go through with some follow-up." "Oh, when you get in there, you'll see," she quickly responded. "It's a mess." "I'm sure it is. Don't you patronize me, young man. This is no mere breaking and entering. This was an all-out assault. You should see that boy." "Well, he's not answering the door." "I already told you that I heard him leave soon after." "If you just heard it, then how can you be sure it was him?" "I saw through the peephole." "He really didn't call you?" "No, ma'am. Your call was the only one we got." "I just can't believe that. It must have been so loud." "You didn't hear anything?" "Well, no, not really. I heard the door when it burst open the first time. I saw someone leave. He brushed right by my door so quickly. These old buildings are built pretty solid. I can sometimes hear my neighbor below me, but I never hear anything from across the hall. I guess it's the way sound travels." The officer sighed. "Oh, you're not even taking me seriously." "I've written down everything you've said." He shook the pink statement sheet of paper at her. "Oh, let me see that. You've probably got it all wrong." She snatched it from him. "Hey," he said as it was ripped from his fingers. She examined it. No. You don't have it right at all. It's not his apartment. It's that girl's. Her name is Suzanne Cooper. It's on her damn mailbox, for God's sake. Do your job." The officer grunted with exasperation. "So he's her boyfriend? Domestic troubles?" "That girl's odd, but I don't think she would have stabbed him with a piece of glass. He started staying with them a few days ago. If you ask me, their whole arrangement is inappropriate. My neighbor Helen, on the first floor, says the girls are, those types that don't like men. Of course, it's none of my business, but they were probably all having sex with each other. Things like that just lead to trouble like this." "You want me to add that to your statement?" "Heavens, no. Don't be ridiculous. I'm just trying to help with whatever information I can for your investigation, which, by the way, doesn't seem to be very far along. Are you ever going to get that door open?" "It's locked. No one's answering. We're getting the key. We're taking care of it." "Frank! Frank!" Another officer was shouting from down the hall at him as he was running towards them. "What is it?" Officer Frank Dover turned from Mrs. Cranston to find out what all the fuss was over. The other officer was a heavy-set Asian man who was huffing and puffing his way towards them. Out of breath, and in between gasps for air, he said, "The super's apartment. You better come here. His door was broken into. The knob is broke off. Frank, we found his body in there. Oh, Jesus, Frank, he's all tore up. You better come down." "Oh, my," Mrs. Cranston said as she put her hand to her mouth. Officer Dover put his hands on her shoulders and gently pushed her back into her apartment doorway. "You better go back inside. We'll come and get more from you later. Just stay inside until I tell you to open up. You look through the peephole for me, okay?" She nodded and shut the door. He could hear her latching it up on the other side. Rob started up the car's engine. No one noticed. Traffic was backed up on both sides of the street in front of him. Some people were starting to honk. He took that as his opportunity to get out of there. It was a little out of his way, but he drove around the blocked-off street to get back to the freeway. Behind him, the street was being blocked off officially, instead of from just poorly parked emergency vehicles, as another body was discovered in Sue's apartment.